great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about the most exciting Italian artists who are shaping the conversation between ecological awareness and art on an international scale. So, in order to structure this talk, I decided to focus on a selected number of artists so that we can get a better sense of what the artistic concerns and aesthetic concerns are, but also get in depth into their practices and their perspectives on the current debate. And before I begin, I wanted to bring us back to a concept that is very important to this series of talks, which is the one we have explored pretty much through every previous presentation, which is ecological mythologies. Now, we looked at ecological mythologies through the work of Ligabue, through the work of Ghirri, and more recently through the work of Pennone. You will remember that ecological mythologies are ways in which we can make sense of our relationship with nature beyond the cultural structures that scientific knowledge allows us. So let's say that ecological mythologies are personal and social ways in which we can bridge that distance between nature and us in ways that are meaningful and in ways that make sense in a world that is becoming more complex and in a world in which we feel more and more alienated from nature itself. You will remember that with Antonio Ligabue especially, the ecological mythologies were linked to his inability to live with others because of his mental affliction. And in the context of diversity and in the context of madness, as we observed in the lecture on Ligabue, his being different entailed a level of empathy with the natural world that others couldn't understand and that therefore marginalized the artist during his lifetime. We also looked at how Ghirri creates his own ecological mythologies throughout the study of plants and the presence of what we can call nature in the Italian suburbia of the second post-World War period. We looked at the aesthetics. We considered the value and the importance of the aesthetics deployed by Ghirri in his representation of very desolate, very linear, very bare environments in suburbia in which nature appears to be somewhat constricted, separate, and forced into a cultural schemata that ultimately defines its life. And with Giuseppe Pennone, we explored the possibility of an ecological mythology that brings us closer. While Ghirri was exploring a sense of alienation in himself, and in a sense didn't offer as much of an opportunity to rekindle that distance or to bridge that distance, what we find with Giuseppe Pennone is this desire to use the body as a measure, a tool that could bring us closer through process, through touch, as you will remember, will bring us closer to nature again, or at least allow us to reconnect on a level that's different from scientific discourses. And as I say this, I also want to stress how important science is in these discourses. As you will see tonight, we'll look at artists who come from scientific backgrounds or who are currently scientists. So the question is not one of replacing science with an alternative set of knowledges, but it's one of aligning scientific discourses, incorporating scientific discourses in a broader picture in which the human is always part of an ecosystemic, complex reality that at times science has left behind. When we say this, what I mean is exactly what we see in this work by Pennone called Soffio di Foglie, Breath of Leaves, which is essentially this intimacy, this proximity, this poetic dimension that we need in order to feel part of the non-human world and ecosystem. So it's particularly important that we balance the rigor and the reliability of scientific knowledge, the empiricism of scientific knowledge, with a poetic dimension that allows us to also care and to find our ways to position ourselves in nature in ways that are respectful and that are engaged. So, in order to begin our journey through the exciting artists who are shaping the conversation of ecology and art in Italy, I'd like to bring you back to my childhood in the city of Milan. And I'm showing you here the beautiful facade of the Natural History Museum in Milan, which was founded in 1838. If you visit Milan, I strongly recommend that you stop by because it's one of the oldest natural history museums in the world, and it is very famous internationally because of the quality of its dioramas. It was one of the pioneer of new technologies in taxidermy and in diorama representation. So you will see show-stopping pieces. And as a child, I used to absolutely love this museum. I was taken there by my parents, and of course, school teachers would take us there. And it was a magical place. I absolutely loved these dioramas, their complexity, their sophistication. It really felt like a magical world. You can imagine in a world as well without the internet where certain images were not accessible. Do you remember that world? We were all there at some point. Those of you who are my age or beyond will remember a world in which if you wanted to look at beautiful images of nature, you had to buy a book, you had to find a book, or you had to wait for a wildlife documentary on TV. And the Natural History Museum was an incredible addition to that repertoire of images where the real animal bodies, or so we thought, stood in this beautiful scenery painted by expert artists. Now, as a child, when I visited these dioramas, I lacked all the critical structure that I have today, which informs my experience. I can never look at these beautiful dioramas again in the way that I did when I was a child. And that's mostly because today I know about the history of taxidermy. I know that it was during the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century appropriated by natural history in order to promote nature preservation, habitat preservation. And there's a strange contradiction embedded in this desire to preserve the natural world. Of course, the contradiction is that you have to kill the animals in order to turn them into taxidermy mounds. And the question of conservation and empathy through taxidermy is, of course, a difficult one to negotiate, especially today, with much more knowledge on colonialist practices and what hunting for the purpose of making taxidermy meant to the ecosystems that have been depleted, for instance. We might think that, natural history museums haven't been participating too prominently in depleting ecosystems, but that's not actually true. So one of the aspects I find more important about the critical awareness is that taxidermy in dioramas as beautiful as the ones we see in Milan always mobilize rhetorical, sublime structures. So you can see here the beautiful seascape with a sunset at the very end, and the way in which the animals are often positioned, the fighting, which is so important to creating a sense of drama and dynamism. So throughout the critical appraisal of taxidermy and the representation of environments that's taken place during the past 30 to 40 years, historians like social historians like Donna Haraway and others have reconsidered the importance of this sublime approach to the image and what it means to stage the animal, in a sense, as a representative of a discourse that ultimately is very separate from us. You can see that we're always absent from the dioramas. Humans pretty much have never existed. It's as if these dioramas are pre-human in the span of time. And therefore, they present an Edenic kind of nature, a nature that is pure, a nature that is not contaminated by human activities. The artists that we're going to look at today do the opposite. They are well aware that humans are animals and that as such they have impacted the history of ecology on this planet, and that therefore it is important to acknowledge our presence, because with the acknowledgement of our presence in the representation of nature itself, then comes a sense of responsibility. There comes a sense of accountability, that it's the foundation of our future on this planet. So I'd like to begin with a reminder of the notion of anthropocentric miseducation. You will remember that I explored this in the very first lecture about Ligabue, the idea of the centrality of the human that emerges during the Italian Renaissance leads to this separation, which is fictitious, of course, between nature and culture, and manifests itself in the power of humanism. Now, humanism is, in a sense, a really important chapter in the history of Western humanity. And it's not per se a negative approach to the understanding of our place in the world. It, however, degenerates perhaps far too quickly throughout the 16th and 17th century into a sense of hubrism and empowerment over nature that becomes detrimental to the planet itself. And it is in works, early works, like the one I am showing you here by Albrecht Dürer, The Great Piece of Turf, that we begin to see early question marks emerging from the tradition of the Renaissance. You can see that Dürer is focusing on something very unusual here, a detailed, an extremely detailed representation of what we would call weeds and grasses. You can recognize some dandelion and some blades of grass. And as such, although this is a study, this painting has become very famous in art historical circles as a celebration of the underdog, as a celebration of the overlooked, and a step away from that sublime heroic representation of nature, which in a sense instills a sense of distance between us and the natural world. So it's a little bit in the spirit. I know, having spoken to many artists today, that this work is very influential to the recent revolution of art and ecology, because it really plants the seed, pun intended, of a new ecological awareness. You can see here the ecological structure of a pyramid, in which at the very top we have a human, not surprisingly also a man, and the ecological perspective on the right, in which everything is important, everything is interconnected, and we are part, with all the other non-human entities, of a broader and complex reality. So this is the framework that these Italian artists are now using in order to explore our relationship with nature. and draw important considerations that we need today. Starting from Francesco Simeti. Francesco Simeti was born in Palermo in 1968, and much of his concern plays on this very notion of the weed, at least in some of the works that he has created. There's a particular project I'm going to show you in a minute, but I wanted to read you this beautiful description. It's not a description actually, but it's a poetic interpretation of Nicola Ricciardi, one of the curators who worked with Simeti in relation to the project. He said, "Mugwort, turnapple, goldenrod, and poppy, arise, children of the weed land, proletariat of the plant kingdom, and topple the thrones of the nobler horticultural flora. Chop off their hyper-civilized, hybridized heads. Gird yourselves and gallop out to overthrow the rose, queen of the garden. The romantics and poets Emerson and Thoreau are with you. Gerard Manley Hopkins is singing, long live the weeds and the wilderness yet." But then the gardener's hand swoops down as maker, warden, and judge of artificial landscapes, and the revolt is already quelled. A hold to the roots and the weeds have been extirpated. Every garden tended by man is a failed coup d'etat, a foundered revolution. So in this beautiful poetic interpretation, we find an important truth. Many of you who are listening tonight have a garden, and if you garden, you know something very important about gardening. We think about gardening as a beautiful activity that's relaxing and that's peaceful, and we sometimes even collapse the very idea with being in nature with gardens, even if some of us go to places like the Home Depot and other box chain stores and buy all the fertilizers as well as weed killers, and everything comes from capitalism, right? All the tools, the plants. But then we go back home and we start digging holes, put it all, display it all, and arrange it in the way that it's pleasant to us, sit back, have a drink, and call it nature, which is the opposite, right? So one of the things that I find fascinating about the garden is this acknowledgement that the garden technically is a war zone. Those of you who garden regularly know how hard it is to keep weeds at bay. They pop up everywhere. They are truly determined to make it. And I think that there is something quite poetic about that determination. So I was very much fascinated by Simeti's idea of a proper battleship, thinking about the garden as a battle and a battleground in which there's always some sort of competition between plants. So you can see here the lances that Simeti has created that are dedicated each to a weed. And each is a beautiful weapon as well as a sculptural entity. In this revolution, there is a lot at stake. But what I also like about Simeti's approach is the humor. I think it's very easy when we think about ecological questions and questions related to nature as a sublime entity to lose ourselves into a very serious tone in which ultimately redemption is the bottom line or should be the bottom line of our engagement. But there's something important about what Simeti accomplishes here in the context of ecological mythologies. This is a great example to me of an ecological mythology in which the artist can envision more than just a garden from the capitalist perspective, or let's say more than just a garden from the objectifying notion of a place in which we display beautiful plants. He's actually focusing on the biological and ecological dynamics that make that space truly alive. Alive in ways that don't quite equate to the balance, the harmony that we would like to accomplish when we garden. Because ultimately, nature is not about balance, it's not about harmony, it's not a place in which humans have a say all the time about what happens, what is good, and what is bad. And sculpture as well as collaging play important roles in Francesco Simeti's work. You can see here again a series of sculptures, part of the Wilds series, in which the artist is exploring the monumentalization of weeds. You have to remember that in the tradition of humanism, only what is important to remember and to celebrate becomes a sculpture. So to monumentalize the weeds is a little bit, to me, the same as what Dürer was doing when he was painting the dandelion and the blades of grass, with such beautiful care for the realism and portraying the messiness. You can see those leaves crossing and entangling in ways that are not necessarily part of the tradition of Renaissance art, which is more tidy, more clean, more neat, but nonetheless are truer to the messiness of the vegetal world. So there's a question of beauty here, and there's a question of aesthetic that I think Simeti is addressing with his sculptural world. What is beauty in the garden, in this battlefield? What is to be preserved and what is to be let go? What is important in the end and what isn't? Now, the embedded tragedy of thinking about weeds, let me just bring you a footnote here. Like, what is a weed is also an important question, right? A question that we haven't addressed. Technically, a weed is just a plant in the wrong place. And when I say a plant in the wrong place, I mean a plant in the wrong place according to us humans who have a very clear idea of where certain things should go. And otherwise, a weed is a very successful plant. Some weeds are absolutely beautiful. You can think about the dandelion. I love dandelion. It's a beautiful yellow flower, it looks sun-like. And then it's also beautiful in a frying pan sizzled with garlic and olive oil, right? I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure, but in Italy, dandelion is a delicacy. We love it. And there are so many other weeds that populate our gardens that have basically garnered the label, the negative label of weeds, only because they are too successful. Many of them happen to be natives. Others have arrived in a way or another and are seen as infestant. They're seen as dangerous elements that corrupt the purity and the harmony of the garden. And as such, weeds have also been used as a metaphor for undesired immigrants. So I mentioned earlier how Francesco Simeti works with the sculptural as well as the 2D representational, creating these beautiful collages. So there are different aesthetics at play in the sculptural and in the two-dimensional. And in this specific work, you can appreciate his technique, which entails scanning the images of botanical representations from books as well as other sources, and then aligning them on a plane so that they compose a beautiful scenery, as we can see here, which to the artist again equate to a pre-human condition in which the human has not corrupted, has not in a sense altered the balances and evolutions of the non-human world in a way that becomes detrimental. And you can see here that Francesco Simeti plays with a sense of beauty and aesthetic that it's peculiar. There's a fascination to the notion that ultimately we cannot know what a pre-human world may have looked like. And there's a sense of a Garden of Eden going on here too, because you can see the different species that seem to belong to different climate happen to bloom together in a time that seems seasonless. And you can also see how the artist is not aiming with the aesthetic that he deploys to reproduce a realistic approach to the image, but he's actually composing something that is flaunting its artificiality. In this artificiality is at stake an anti-diorama approach. If the diorama of the Natural History Museum pretends to be true in its representation, to be the reality itself, what we actually find with Francesco Simeti is that the construction of nature as such is revealed by the evidence of the collage that we see here. Nature is a construct. If you think about the non-human, all the trees, the bees, the flies, the dogs, all of these are part of a non-human world that we have called nature. But nature comes with its cultural anchors, with its cultural realities that have been attached to the non-human, because these realities live in our minds and not out there, in the fluidity, in the becoming, in the uncontainable world that we call nature. So Francesco Simeti represents this fluidity, this becoming, this impossibility to classify through curtains and wallpapers in which no hierarchies exist. And this is also important because, of course, natural history became, during the 17th and 18th century, the discipline of hierarchy. The dream of natural history was to classify and to organize in order to understand God's master plan. And that's part of the drive that led to the extermination of many animals. The idea that in order to define species, it was important to collect specimens and understand at what point one species of bird becomes another species. For that purpose, many individuals of each species were needed. If you open the drawers of the behind the scenes of any natural history museum in the world, there are hundreds and hundreds of study skins of individual animals that have been killed for that very purpose. And of course, they also are reminders of the animal deaths that have incurred in the name of developing knowledge on nature itself. So it's a double-edged sword. We Okay, so that gives you an idea of how intriguing these animations are in the sense that they evoke a sense of awe, but also you can notice that the artist uses different media from photography to illustration and painting in order to break the boundaries of traditional botanical illustration and to piece together through as well the acoustic element a sense of intimacy and a sense of proximity with the natural world that transcends the realm of science. And I also wanted to make those of you who live in Chicago aware that you can see the work of Francesco Simeti, the installation, a system of architectural ornament at the Addison Blue Line station. It was a commission that took place in 2020, and it was very much inspired by local native flora. So the plants that you see um, on the windows and in the form of a collage that it's typical of Simeti's approach are indigenous flora, and they are situated on the windows at this specific station because in a sense the artist is trying to create a correlation between the work of Louis Sullivan and the architectural structure the architectural structures that were deployed by the architect. As you can see here visible in the images, they are inspired by plants and integrated in the flora that it's indigenous of Chicago. So there is an emphasis on a site-specific approach that you can enjoy if you visit this station. The second artist that I wanted to focus on today is Eugenio Tibaldi. Eugenio Tibaldi is a very interesting artist whose work is also very much grounded in research. He was born in 1997 in Alba in Piedmont, and he's been living in Naples since 2000, so for a very long while. He's been living at the periphery of Naples, and he works in many different media. Again, one of the specific interests the artist has developed over time is with suburbia, territories, and the place that plants can occupy in these discourses as an opportunity to rethink the human order and anthropocentrism. The image I'm showing you here is from anthropogenic herbarium, the herbarium of the Anthropocene. And it was commissioned, it was part of a commission that the artist created for the Zoma Museum at Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. The artist found himself traveling around the city, especially visiting the areas of the suburbia and noticing that some of them felt like difficult to grasp in the sense that they bore a sense of promise of a better future, and at the same time, they couldn't quite actuate that in their own right. So these anthropogenic herbaria these plates from an anthropogenic herbarium are the result of the artist's travels, like it used to be during the colonialist period when artists would travel to a different place and produce illustrations, geographical illustrations, as well as illustrations of plants. The artist has said that the margin is the space where I believe that change can take place. Far from the spotlight and the perfection of the center, the lateral becomes the territory of mutation. So the best one through which to attempt a definition of the contemporary. And these herbaria by Tibaldi reminded me of a very different approach, but related in some sense. You can see again the architectural and the vegetal like coming together, like we saw at the very end of Francesco Simeti's work. In this case, this work by Gerardo Cibo, this is illustrated by Gerardo Cibo, one of the most important botanists of the 16th century, who had already understood that the plant in itself is not the only important thing to study, but its relationship with the city, the landscape, well, in this case, the town in which it can be found was essential. So we find that relationship between geography and also urbanization and the impact of the human and the plant being present in Eugenio Tibaldi's work. The presence of the plant as a superimposed structure proposes an opportunity for a more positive change. And a lot of Eugenio Tibaldi's work is also centered on the notion of perception and interpretation, how we make sense of the natural world. As you saw earlier, the maps are not real maps. The maps have been rethought as seen from the promise of vegetation, promise of plants. In this case, we find the same with this habitat, which the artist has described as a place of the mind, which is a place where we can hide and return to as a safe place, a place that we associate with nature and that ultimately, after all, has nothing to do with nature. As you can see here, we have a number of cultivars that are placed in a pond surrounded with some tools as well as toys. And it's a kind of trivialization of the very idea of nature and how nature can become a safe space for us. Is nature ever going to be safe, or was nature ever a safe place for us? And we can see here again in the entrance of the temporary landscape exhibition that gather many works by Eugenio Tibaldi, how the pots have been remodeled in order to create a continuity between furnishing and pots. You can see the connection between with pipes between pots. Again, a symbol of the interconnectedness that dominates nature and of which we are part. And I also wanted to show you this work called Architettura dell'isolamento, in which the artist, this is another pandemic-generated work, in which the artist gathered together a number of memorabilia that were kept in an apartment in Turin and which had been left untouched for roughly 10 years. The apartment used to belong to a history professor who was particularly fond, or let's say interested in war, and who collected a number of memorabilia that date back to the era of fascism and modern Italian history. And what the artist found interesting about these objects was especially the idea of accumulation, the idea of history, how objects can be accumulated beyond the need of functionalism and functionality, and what does it mean to amass objects beyond our needs to a point that they begin to paralyze us. So in a sense, accumulating these objects makes us think about the tradition of taxidermy in the Natural History Museum, and even then, how we have amassed all these animal bodies and animal skins that are perhaps even too many for us to sieve through and to comprehend. There's an excessiveness of data that is produced through human practices that aim to develop an idea of knowledge, an idea of presence and understanding of the world around us that then can end up at some point smothering us and confusing our perspectives. So Eugenio Tibaldi then represents himself as a tree. The idea of a self-portrait as a tree is, as you can see here, not so much envisioned as a growing opportunity, but as a conglomeration of everyday objects and a trunk. There's something about this connection between everyday objects and plants that returns in Eugenio Tibaldi's work, and that we see also here in the piece called Symposium, in which a chair is the trunk of a tree, and from this chair these branches expand where in a collection, there's a collection of birds, a gathering of birds that's engaged in a symposium, which is another, I think, mythical figure. And you can see that the artist is not making it a mystery that these birds are actually cut out from illustrations, natural history illustration, and they're not real birds. once again, a reminder of the division, the separation between us and the natural world, the mediation that it's inescapable. This work, called Giardino Abusivo, which is an illegal garden, is an attempt on behalf of the artist to understand the failures of classical culture. So you can think about Italian classical gardens and the structural, geometrical perfection that characterizes them. It's here replaced by what looks like a dump. We have fridge freezers that have been clearly through a lot. They're old, they're no longer functioning, and these plants are reclaiming their place among them. The question is, who is illegal in this mix? And of course, this is a project that the artist has explored at length in this incarnation that was staged at the Museo del Novecento in Milan. The artist also connected a system, a water irrigation system that you can see connecting the different plants and the discarded objects that we see in the installation, that was recycling rainwater from the building. And the next artist I'd like to talk about is Giorgia Lupi. We talked a lot about science and the difficult relationship between science and representation and the space. How can we open a space between the data, the information that science presents to us, so that we can feel connected to the natural world rather than alienated? And I think that in more than one way, Lupi's desire is to bridge that separation in the most effective of ways. Some of you may have visited the Broken Nature exhibition at the Milan Triennale in 2019. It was a fabulous exhibition that gathered together the work of a number of artists from around the world, engaging in the concepts of eco-criticism as well as conservation and sustainability. It was curated by Paola Antonelli, very influential curator at MoMA in New York. And Giorgia Lupi exhibited this installation called The Room of Change. Now, the Room of Change was a place in which visitors could experience data that was visually rendered, depicting the world from both global and local individual perspectives. And the installation in this way told stories of people and their relationship with what was around them over time, layering dense and granular information within the narration to highlight how change is pervasive at all scales. There is an interesting question of scale that we encounter every time we think about data, especially right now in the context of climate change. Everything seems to be too big, too enormous, too mind-boggling to contemplate for us, and we feel powerless. And in a sense, that's where Giorgia Lupi situates her practice, in this sense of powerlessness, producing installations that invite us to visualize at a glance through rhythms and patterns, tools and media that we are familiar with and that we can, in a sense, begin to appreciate in different ways. I have to stress as well that Giorgia Lupi is technically an information designer and also partner design of the firm Pentagram. So she intervenes in the artistic discourse from a scientific background. One of her most interesting projects took place in 2021 and is called Plastic is in the Air. I know that's probably not the news you wanted to hear. Apologies about that. But with her team at Pentagram, Lupi conceptualized and designed a project that was a collaboration with Google Arts and Culture. And it was released on Earth Day 2021. Now, you've all heard about microplastics. Microplastics are incredibly pervasive, again, and yet they are invisible. So you can see the concerns here repeating. The website you can actually visit online, it's still active, presents a visualization of microplastics, showing how detrimental their impact is. These are some of the screen grabs of the presentations of the video, and I actually have a clip that shows you how the website works. I'm going to play a short segment of. So one of the important aspects, I think, of Giorgia Lupi's approach here is to make us aware of how every object that we use, that it's made of plastic, eventually ends up releasing microplastics into the atmosphere. Microplastics that then are ingested and enter our bodies in a number of ways, therefore contaminating us as well as the rest of the planet. And I am going to wrap up our presentation for tonight with two exceptional street artists. One of them is Andreco and the other one, Iena Cruz. There's something really interesting about street art because I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea that art doesn't necessarily need to instigate change. Cultural change happens through art, but there's a difficult balance between art and activism. And at what point is art aiming to instill activism becoming propaganda and therefore losing its power as art and becoming a tool that is somewhat different? And I think the question of where do we place art about the environment? Should it be accessible? Should it be accessible in the sense of understandable as well as in the sense of reachable? And I think these street artists have this very issue at heart. Accessibility is very, very important to them. And Andreco is a really interesting artist that was born in Rome in 1978 and is a scientist by training with a doctoral degree in environmental engineering and a postdoctoral degree in green technology and sustainability. So his work as an artist is informed by his scientific view. We have talked about the sublime quite a bit tonight and how, in a sense, there's the ability of the sublime to distance ourselves from nature, as we have seen in the natural history dioramas, but the need for ecological mythologies to draw us close in needs to find new aesthetics that can, in a sense, bridge that gap in order to bring us closer to the natural world. And you can see how Andreco has developed an aesthetic that it's interesting in the sense that it tries to communicate a lot of information in very synthetic and clear ways. These rocky structures that you see here are a recurrent motif in his work and make his work very recognizable. But there's more. It's not just an aesthetic solution. Now, the artist uses air ink, which is a specific, special pigment that is produced and used in order to transfer the pollution from the air and to fix it onto the surface of walls. Air pollution is responsible for more than 5 million deaths every year, and Air Ink The brand wants to take something as pervasive as air pollution and turn it into something as common as ink. The more air ink on your page, the less pollution in your lungs. So these works that are created by Andreco have this quality of actually putting to work. They're ecologically sustainable in a sense, and they're putting to work what's the cause of environmental degradation. You can see how, in this case, in Belluno, the artist has created throughout his trademark style a continuation between human architecture and the mountains when seen, of course, when the building is seen from one point of view more specifically, and more than one at that. So there is, again, room for a poetic approach that's particularly important to the artist. And yet, Andreco is also interested in graphs and figures, as you can see here. So the anchoring, the marrying of poetics with scientific knowledge, scientific representation is important. You can see in here in Venice drawing the levels of water as they will rise up decade after decade, and then eventually century after century based on contemporary projections. The artist has also been involved in studies that are particularly timely and important on the sustainability of green roofs. These are some of the examples he has worked on. As you can see, he works all over the world, and this is an example from New York in which the viability of integration of plants and architecture was being explored. And the artist, I have to say, very, very often returns to the idea that plants are the essential key to the remedying of environmental degradation. In this installation inside the gallery space, you can see how the artist works outside and inside the gallery space, we see a gathering of ferns and hemp. This is because ferns and hemp have the ability to transform and absorb heavy metals from the ground through their roots, so they're actually purifying the ground. So this becomes the future landscape. Imagine a garden that is no longer designed and orchestrated based on our aesthetic pleasure, but on the benefits it brings to the soil. And in 2019, Andreco traveled to India in order to stage one of the performances. That's another thing the artist does. It's to work with performances that engage the local community. And in order to sensitize audiences about the terrible record of Delhi as the most polluted city in the world. So he designed a number of flags and organized a parade in order to gather and charge the local community. And parades are very important to the artist. They are a way in which scientific knowledge, and we're going back to the conception of ecological mythology, can be made accessible, can be made relevant to everyday people. We have to remember that it's complicated, even for educated people, to access scientific data, and ways in which scientific data can be magnified and brought to people in ways that are eye-catchy and attention-grabbing are perhaps what we need. For a long time, conceptual art has driven us to embrace aesthetics that are very dry, that are very inaccessible. And I think that these artists are, in a sense, revolutionizing not only the conversation between ecology and art, but also the conversation in conceptual art and contemporary art. What are the aesthetics? What are the means through which we can engage people to feel part of the conversation? And I wanted to show you a clip, again, of the work of Andreco here with this performance that he staged on the River Tiber in Rome. And just because time is not our friend, I want to wrap up our presentation, as I promised, with Iena Cruz, another really interesting artist. The real name is Federico Massa, born in Milan in 1981, who works on very large scale murals. As you can see here, this is High Tide, that's visible in Long Island. And the implication with Iena Cruz is to create awareness of the interconnectedness, the links between the natural world and the built environment, the urban dimension that creates pollution and ultimately degrades the environment. We can see his hyper-realistic representation of animal is partnered to a much more synthetic approach to human architecture. And the sense of incorporation of the natural, you can see here Iena Cruz at work, is visible if you zoom out and understand the connection between the building and how the mural fits into the building. This is a recurring approach the artist explores. He also uses a paint that is ecologically sustainable. His paint is called Airlight. Thanks to a mechanism known as photocatalysis, the ecological paint in question is activated by light, which frees its oxidizing molecules, which can transform the harmful particles in the air into inert salts. This helps to reduce the level of volatile organic composts, nitrogen monoxide, and dioxide in the air, and more. The product can also reduce the presence of toxic bacteria. You can see here another work. This is just outside Milan, and it's a very interesting representation in which the artist overlays different signifiers. Like in this case, there's a oil refinery platform, as you can see, with the now iconic, often seen plumes of smoke and flames, which is contained into one of those water bottles that we find in offices. So the connection between petrol and the production of plastic and the embottlement of the marine life, and therefore this kind of connectivity between life and pollution that encompasses different realities from our offices and domestic realities impacts the wildlife in the ocean. Some of you might be wondering also about this recurring symbol that we've already seen more than once. That's a Mexican mandala that Iena Cruz has started to incorporate in his work since he relocated to New York, and has become more and more engaged with different cultures. You can see once again here the hyperrealism with which the artist is aiming to bridge the divide between us and nature. Another impressive mural in Rome, again realized with an amount of paint of Airlight that actually absorbs the equivalent of 30 trees, and the equivalent of pollution of 30 trees. And you can see here again a connection between water, which is very important in the concept of the artist who works with a number of charities like the Ocean Family Foundation and North Sails, in order to raise awareness of plights that impact water across the world. And you can see here how the figure of the drop recurs in the artist's work, and it's a recurring image that to the artist represents this cycle of life, which also entails our embeddedness, our being part of the natural ecosystem. We are in the ecosystem. What we put out there returns to us in the end. And this is the last image in my presentation. It's the facade of the Madonna dell'Olmo Middle School, in which the artist is, with the collaboration of the students at the school, creating this beautiful mural that, as you can see, aims at representing biodiversity and the evolutional interconnectedness of biodiversity, the connection between different animals as well as plants, but not, again, seen from the perspective of science. This is not an evolutional chart, but it's actually a free-flowing ecological mythology in its own right. Thank you very much.